Easter Sunday, 1975, began the way it often does, quietly, gently, with a sense of routine and comfort that families come to rely on over the years. For one American family, it was meant to be a day of togetherness. Relatives gathered under one roof, sharing a meal, conversation, and the familiar rhythms of a holiday that traditionally centers on renewal and peace. Nothing about that morning hinted at what was to come. There were no arguments, no visible tensions, no warning signs that anything was out of place. And yet, within a span of less than 5 minutes, that calm would be shattered in a way almost too brutal to comprehend. By the time it was over, 11 family members were dead. The speed of it is what unsettles most people. There was no prolonged struggle, no chaos spilling out into the neighborhood, no desperate calls for help. Just sudden, decisive violence, methodical and absolute. It left investigators with a chilling reality: this was not a crime born out of panic or confusion. It was controlled. Intentional. Almost clinical in its execution. What made the case even more disturbing was the identity of the killer. He wasn't an outsider forcing his way in. He wasn't someone the family feared or even mistrusted. He was, by all outward appearances, a quiet, unremarkable man, someone who had blended into the background of everyday life so completely that he barely registered in the minds of others. The kind of person neighbors might describe as polite, reserved, maybe even forgettable. And yet, behind that ordinary exterior, something far darker had taken shape. After the killings, what he did next only deepened the mystery. He didn't flee. He didn't attempt to hide what had happened. Instead, he remained in the house, sitting among the bodies for hours. That detail alone has haunted both investigators and the public for decades. What was he thinking in that silence? Was it shock? Regret? Or was it something colder, a sense of completion, as though he had carried out a plan exactly as intended? Eventually, he picked up the phone and calmly contacted the police. No frantic tone. No attempt to distort the facts. Just a composed admission that something terrible had occurred. When authorities arrived, they were met not with resistance, but with a man who seemed almost detached from the enormity of what he had done. It was this composure, more than anything else, that raised the most unsettling questions. Was this the act of a man who snapped in a moment of overwhelming emotion? Or was it something that had been building quietly, carefully, over time? The absence of chaos suggests planning. The precision suggests forethought. And yet, the sheer scale of the violence points to something deeply fractured within the human psyche. This is where the case becomes more than just a tragic event, it becomes a psychological puzzle. On one hand, there are those who argue insanity, pointing to the unimaginable nature of the act itself. How could a rational mind carry out something so devastating against its own family? On the other hand, there are those who see clear signs of calculation, the timing, the efficiency, the lack of interruption, and the composed aftermath. And that leaves us with the question that continues to linger, even decades later. Not just what happened, but why, and how. Was this a man who lost control in a single, irreversible moment? Or was he someone who had already made the decision long before that Easter Sunday began, quietly waiting for the right time to carry it out? Because if it was planned, if every second was considered in advance, then what we're looking at isn't just a tragedy. It's something far more unsettling, the possibility that such darkness can exist, undetected, behind the most ordinary of faces. James Ruppert's story does not begin on Easter Sunday, 1975, it begins decades earlier, in a home that, by nearly every account, was quietly unraveling behind closed doors in Hamilton, Ohio. From the outside, it may have looked like an ordinary American household, but inside, the emotional climate was anything but stable. His father was known to be harsh and often violent, a man whose anger set the tone for the home, while his mother was described as distant, critical, and emotionally withholding. There was little warmth, little encouragement, and even less understanding. For a young boy trying to find his place in the world, it was an environment that offered no safe ground. And then there was his brother, confident, capable, and seemingly favored in every way that mattered. Where James struggled, his brother excelled. Where James withdrew, his brother advanced. Over time, the comparison became unavoidable, and for James, it was deeply damaging. The years that followed were shaped by a steady accumulation of humiliation and rejection. It wasn't always loud or dramatic, often, it was subtle, dismissive comments, unmet expectations, the quiet but persistent message that he simply wasn't enough. That kind of environment doesn't just pass through a person, it settles in, reshaping how they see themselves and the world around them. James became increasingly withdrawn, retreating inward as a way of coping with a reality that offered him little validation. Social connections faded, ambition stalled, and what remained was a growing sense of isolation. By the time he reached adolescence, the emotional toll had already taken a serious hold. At 16, he attempted to take his own life. It was a moment that, in many cases, might have triggered intervention, support, or at least recognition that something was deeply wrong. But for James, it seemed to mark a different kind of turning point, not one of recovery, but of resignation. When he survived, he didn't emerge with renewed hope, instead, he appeared to stop trying altogether. It was as though something inside him had quietly shut down. The idea of building a future, of striving for something better, began to feel out of reach, even pointless. And that sense of futility followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, the gap between James and the life he might have had only widened. He struggled to maintain steady employment, drifting between short-lived opportunities that never seemed to lead anywhere. Eventually, he found himself back where he had started, living with his mother, financially dependent, and increasingly disconnected from any sense of purpose. The world around him moved forward, but he remained stuck, watching from the sidelines. And with that stagnation came something else, resentment. It didn't erupt all at once, it built slowly, layer by layer, fed by comparison, regret, and a deepening sense of failure. Alcohol became a constant presence, not just as a habit, but as a way to dull the weight of everything he couldn't change. Meanwhile, his brother's life seemed to unfold in exactly the opposite direction. He built a career, established a home, and started a family, 8 children, a full and active household that reflected stability and success. It was everything James had not achieved, everything he had once hoped for but could no longer see as possible. And then came what James would later perceive as the ultimate betrayal: his brother married a woman James had once loved. Whether that relationship had ever been serious or mutual is less clear, but in James's mind, it became symbolic. A final confirmation that even the most personal parts of his life had been overshadowed and taken from him. By the mid-1970s, the pressure had reached a critical point. Financial difficulties were mounting, and there were growing concerns about eviction from the home he shared with his mother. The sense of instability was no longer abstract, it was immediate and tangible. At the same time, his internal world had become increasingly hostile, shaped by years of unresolved anger and perceived injustice. To an outside observer, he may have appeared quiet, even passive. But beneath that surface, something far more volatile had been forming over time, fed by isolation, disappointment, and a deep-rooted belief that he had been wronged by those closest to him. And then Easter Sunday arrived, a day that, for most families, is defined by routine and familiarity. It was meant to be a simple gathering, a shared meal, a continuation of tradition. Relatives came together under one roof, likely expecting nothing more than conversation, laughter, and the comfort of being among family. There was no indication that anything was different, no visible sign that the day would unfold in any way other than it always had. But for James, this was not just another holiday. It was, in many ways, the convergence of everything that had been building over the years. What makes this moment so difficult to fully understand is how ordinary it appeared from the outside. There was no dramatic lead-up, no public unraveling that might have signaled what was about to happen. And yet, internally, the conditions had been set, years of emotional damage, compounded by immediate stress and long-standing resentment. Whether what followed was the result of a sudden break or the final step in a long, unspoken plan remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Because when a life is shaped by that kind of sustained isolation and perceived failure, the line between impulse and intention can become blurred. Did he reach a breaking point in that moment, overwhelmed by everything he had carried for so long? Or had he already crossed that line days, weeks, even months earlier, quietly deciding what he would do when the opportunity came? Easter Sunday, with the entire family gathered in one place, may not have been a coincidence. It may have been, in his mind, the moment when everything would finally be resolved, though in a way no one could have imagined. And that is what makes this story so deeply unsettling. It forces a confrontation with the idea that such an outcome doesn't always come from a single moment of madness, but can instead emerge from years of unnoticed suffering, distorted thinking, and unresolved pain. By the time that Easter morning turned into something unimaginable, the groundwork had already been laid. The question that lingers is not just what happened that day, but how long it had truly been in the making, quietly taking shape behind a life that, to everyone else, seemed simply sad, but not dangerous. As the years wore on, the internal pressure building inside James Ruppert did not simply remain emotional, it began to take on more tangible, more dangerous forms. One of the most telling developments was his growing obsession with firearms. What may have started as a casual interest gradually became something far more consuming. He spent increasing amounts of time focused on guns and target practice, immersing himself in the mechanics, the control, and perhaps the sense of power they provided, something that had long been missing from his life. He owned multiple weapons, including a .357 Magnum, a firearm known for its precision and devastating force. For a man who felt powerless in nearly every other aspect of his existence, this fixation offered a stark contrast. Here, at least, he was in control. At the same time, his reliance on alcohol deepened. Drinking was no longer occasional or social, it became habitual, heavy, and increasingly necessary just to get through the day. Alcohol dulled the edges of his frustration, softened the constant comparisons, and muted the sense of failure that had followed him for years. But it also did something else. It lowered inhibitions, blurred judgment, and allowed darker thoughts to settle in without resistance. What might have once been fleeting anger could now linger, grow, and take on a life of its own. In that state, resentment is not just felt, it is rehearsed, replayed, and reinforced until it begins to feel justified. In the days leading up to Easter Sunday, 1975, there were subtle but deeply unsettling signs that something was shifting. Witnesses would later recall seeing Ruppert at the river, practicing his shooting with a level of focus that seemed unusual even for him. It wasn't just a hobby in those moments, it appeared deliberate, almost purposeful. Around the same time, he was reportedly asking questions about silencers while purchasing ammunition. That detail, in particular, would stand out to investigators later, not because it proved intent on its own, but because it suggested forethought, an awareness of sound, of concealment, of control over how events might unfold. Then came the night before. In a moment that might have easily been dismissed at the time, Ruppert spoke to a bartender and admitted that he had a problem he needed to solve. It wasn't a dramatic confession, not a detailed explanation, just a vague but loaded statement that hinted at something unresolved, something pressing. In isolation, it might have sounded like the kind of comment many people make under stress. But in hindsight, it carries a different weight. It raises the question of whether, at that point, he already knew what he was going to do. Or whether he was standing on the edge of a decision, not yet fully committed, but dangerously close. By the time Easter morning arrived, everything appeared outwardly normal. The family gathered as they always did, stepping into the comfort of routine without the slightest awareness of what was unfolding beneath the surface. There were no visible warning signs, no tension that anyone could point to and say something was wrong. It was, by all appearances, just another holiday gathering, one that should have passed quietly, like so many before it. And then, in a moment that would later be examined again and again, something seemingly small occurred. His brother asked him a simple question, about his car. On its own, it was insignificant, the kind of casual remark exchanged countless times within families. But for Ruppert, it appears to have struck something much deeper. Whether it touched on financial strain, personal failure, or the long-standing sense of being judged and diminished, we can't say with certainty. What we do know is that it acted as a trigger, one that connected not just to that moment, but to years of accumulated resentment and perceived humiliation. This is where the narrative becomes deeply complex. On the surface, it can be framed as a sudden reaction, a man pushed too far by a seemingly minor interaction, finally snapping under the weight of everything he had carried. But when viewed alongside the events of the preceding days, the target practice, the questions about silencers, the comment to the bartender, it becomes much harder to see it as purely impulsive. Instead, it begins to look like something else entirely, a moment that didn't create the violence, but released it. Investigators would later grapple with this exact question. Was this truly a spontaneous act, born out of a single triggering exchange? Or was that question about the car simply the final push, the last piece needed to set into motion something that had already been forming? If the latter is true, then Easter Sunday was not an accident of timing, it was an opportunity. A day when everyone would be present, gathered together, unaware and unguarded. And that possibility is what makes the case so deeply unsettling. It suggests that what happened was not just the result of emotional collapse, but potentially the execution of an idea that had been quietly taking shape. An idea reinforced by isolation, fueled by alcohol, and made possible by access to weapons and a growing familiarity with their use. By the time that simple question was asked, the decision may have already been made, long before anyone else in that house realized they were in danger. In the end, that is the question that continues to linger, not just what triggered the violence, but when it truly began. Was it in that fleeting exchange on Easter morning, or was it days, weeks, even years earlier, in the slow, invisible buildup of anger and despair? Because if it was already in motion, then what appeared to be a sudden eruption was, in reality, the final step in a process that had been unfolding all along, quietly, methodically, and fatally unnoticed. At around 6 p.m. that evening, the course of events took a turn from which there would be no return. Rather than leaving the house or distancing himself from the tension that may have been building internally, James Ruppert did something far more deliberate. He retrieved multiple firearms. That decision alone, quiet, controlled, and purposeful, marks a critical moment. It suggests not panic, but intent. Not confusion, but direction. Whatever thoughts had been forming in the days and hours before, they now moved into action. He began in the kitchen, a place typically associated with warmth, conversation, and family connection. It was there that the first shots were fired. His mother, his brother, his sister-in-law, and the children present in that space became the initial victims. There was no argument escalating into violence. No drawn-out confrontation. It happened quickly, decisively, with a level of efficiency that would later leave investigators deeply unsettled. From the very start, this was not chaotic, it was controlled. What followed was even more chilling. Ruppert moved through the house, room by room, systematically locating and killing each remaining family member. There was no randomness to his actions. He knew the layout of the home, knew where people would be, and moved with a clarity that suggests he was not searching, he was executing. Each step carried him further into something irreversible, and yet there was no hesitation reported, no pause that might indicate second thoughts. It unfolded with a pace and precision that is difficult to comprehend. In total, he fired 44 shots. That number alone speaks to the scale and determination behind the act. But what stands out even more is what investigators discovered afterward. In some cases, he returned to victims and fired again, ensuring there was no chance of survival. That detail removes any lingering notion of uncertainty or loss of control. It points instead to something calculated, something final. This was not just violence, it was completion. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it was over. The entire massacre lasted less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to erase an entire family. 5 minutes to transform a home filled with life into a scene of silence and devastation. It's that contrast, the speed of the act against the permanence of its consequences, that makes it so profoundly disturbing. But what happened next is, in many ways, even harder to understand. Ruppert did not flee the scene. He did not attempt to hide what he had done or create a false narrative. Instead, he remained inside the house, surrounded by the aftermath. For hours, he sat there among the bodies. No movement, no urgency, just stillness. It's a detail that raises more questions than answers. What occupies a person's mind in that kind of silence? No drawn-out confrontation. It happened quickly, decisively, with a level of efficiency that would later leave investigators deeply unsettled. From the very start, this was not chaotic, it was controlled. What followed was even more chilling. Ruppert moved through the house, room by room, systematically locating and killing each remaining family member. There was no randomness to his actions. He knew the layout of the home, knew where people would be, and moved with a clarity that suggests he was not searching, he was executing. Each step carried him further into something irreversible, and yet there was no hesitation reported, no pause that might indicate second thoughts. It unfolded with a pace and precision that is difficult to comprehend. In total, he fired 44 shots. That number alone speaks to the scale and determination behind the act. But what stands out even more is what investigators discovered afterward. In some cases, he returned to victims and fired again, ensuring there was no chance of survival. That detail removes any lingering notion of uncertainty or loss of control. It points instead to something calculated, something final. This was not just violence, it was completion. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it was over. The entire massacre lasted less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to erase an entire family. 5 minutes to transform a home filled with life into a scene of silence and devastation. It's that contrast, the speed of the act against the permanence of its consequences, that makes it so profoundly disturbing. But what happened next is, in many ways, even harder to understand. Ruppert did not flee the scene. He did not attempt to hide what he had done or create a false narrative. Instead, he remained inside the house, surrounded by the aftermath. For hours, he sat there among the bodies. No movement, no urgency, just stillness. It's a detail that raises more questions than answers. What occupies a person's mind in that kind of silence? Was he reflecting, processing, or simply existing in a state of emotional detachment? There are no clear answers, only the unsettling image of a man who had just committed an unthinkable act, sitting quietly within it. At some point during those hours, he considered taking his own life. The thought was there, by his own account. But ultimately, he chose not to act on it. That decision, whether driven by fear, resignation, or something else entirely, meant that he would remain, not just alive, but accountable. And in that moment, the narrative shifts again. Because instead of ending the story there, he made a different choice. He picked up the phone and called the police. There was no panic in his voice, no attempt to minimize or distort what had happened. He reported the shooting calmly, almost matter-of-factly, as though he were describing something routine. That composure, that absence of visible emotion, would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. It stood in stark contrast to the reality inside the house. When officers arrived, they were met not with resistance, but with a man who appeared composed, almost ordinary in his demeanor. He greeted them without aggression, without urgency, as if the events of the past few hours existed in a separate space, disconnected from the moment at hand. There was no visible breakdown, no outward display of the magnitude of what had occurred. But once inside, the reality was impossible to ignore. The scene has been described as one of unimaginable horror, even by seasoned officers accustomed to violence. The scale, the stillness, the sheer finality of it all, it left a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. Blood had soaked through parts of the house, seeping into floors, marking the spaces where life had ended so abruptly. Rooms that had once held conversation, laughter, and movement were now silent. Completely, unnaturally silent. Was he reflecting, processing, or simply existing in a state of emotional detachment? There are no clear answers, only the unsettling image of a man who had just committed an unthinkable act, sitting quietly within it. At some point during those hours, he considered taking his own life. The thought was there, by his own account. But ultimately, he chose not to act on it. That decision, whether driven by fear, resignation, or something else entirely, meant that he would remain, not just alive, but accountable. And in that moment, the narrative shifts again. Because instead of ending the story there, he made a different choice. He picked up the phone and called the police. There was no panic in his voice, no attempt to minimize or distort what had happened. He reported the shooting calmly, almost matter-of-factly, as though he were describing something routine. That composure, that absence of visible emotion, would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. It stood in stark contrast to the reality inside the house. When officers arrived, they were met not with resistance, but with a man who appeared composed, almost ordinary in his demeanor. He greeted them without aggression, without urgency, as if the events of the past few hours existed in a separate space, disconnected from the moment at hand. There was no visible breakdown, no outward display of the magnitude of what had occurred. But once inside, the reality was impossible to ignore. The scene has been described as one of unimaginable horror, even by seasoned officers accustomed to violence. The scale, the stillness, the sheer finality of it all, it left a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. Blood had soaked through parts of the house, seeping into floors, marking the spaces where life had ended so abruptly. Rooms that had once held conversation, laughter, and movement were now silent. Completely, unnaturally silent. It wasn't just the number of victims or the brutality of the act, it was the contrast. A family home, reduced in minutes to something unrecognizable. A place that should have felt safe, now carrying the weight of something irreversible. Outside the house, the shock spread quickly through the community. Neighbors, acquaintances, and those who had known Ruppert struggled to reconcile what they were hearing with the person they thought they knew. The descriptions were consistent, quiet, polite, harmless. Not someone who stood out, not someone who raised concern. If anything, he was the kind of person who faded into the background, unremarkable, unthreatening. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Because it forces a confrontation with a difficult reality, that the capacity for such violence does not always announce itself. It doesn't always come with clear warnings or visible signs. Sometimes, it exists quietly, beneath the surface, shaped over time by factors that go unnoticed or unaddressed. By the time it reveals itself, it's already too late. In the end, what remains is not just the horror of what happened, but the lingering question of how it was able to happen at all. A man described as ordinary carried out something extraordinary in its brutality. A family gathering turned into a tragedy in less time than it takes to grasp what's unfolding. And a community was left trying to understand how someone so seemingly unremarkable could become the center of something so devastating. It's a story that resists simple explanations. Because the answers, if they exist at all, are buried not just in those final 5 minutes, but in everything that came before them. In the aftermath of the massacre, when the immediate shock began to settle into a long and complex legal process, James Ruppert did not deny what he had done. He admitted to the killings. There was no attempt to shift blame, no effort to construct an alternate version of events. Instead, his defense took a different path, one that would shape the entire course of the trials that followed. He claimed insanity. For his legal team, the argument centered on the life he had lived leading up to that Easter Sunday. They pointed to years of emotional damage, an abusive father, a cold and dismissive mother, and a lifetime of feeling overshadowed and diminished by his brother. They described a man who had been worn down over decades, whose sense of self had eroded to the point where reality itself may have fractured. According to this view, the massacre was not a calculated act, but the result of a psychotic break, a moment where accumulated trauma and pressure finally overwhelmed his ability to think rationally or control his actions. But the prosecution saw something very different. They focused not on his past, but on his behavior, particularly in the days and hours leading up to the killings. They pointed to the target practice at the river, the questions about silencers, and the calm, methodical way the murders were carried out. They highlighted the sheer precision of the act, moving room to room, firing 44 shots, returning to ensure no one survived. This, they argued, was not chaos. It was control. One of the most debated details was the timing. Investigators suggested that Ruppert may have coordinated the shooting with the ringing of nearby church bells, sounds that could mask the gunfire and delay any immediate response from neighbors. If true, it would indicate a level of planning that is difficult to reconcile with a sudden loss of reality. It suggests awareness, foresight, and an understanding of consequences. There were also questions surrounding motive beyond emotion. The prosecution introduced the possibility that financial gain played a role, that Ruppert, struggling with money and facing instability, may have seen the deaths of family members as a way to access inheritance funds. While this theory was not without debate, it added another layer to the case, the idea that the act may not have been purely driven by psychological collapse, but also by calculated self-interest. As the case moved through the courts, it became a battleground of expert opinions. Psychiatrists and psychologists were called to evaluate Ruppert's mental state, and their conclusions often conflicted sharply. Some described him as deeply disturbed, a man disconnected from reality at the time of the killings. Others saw him as fully aware, capable of understanding his actions and their consequences, even if driven by anger and resentment. Judges, too, were divided, some leaning toward the defense's argument of insanity, others aligning with the prosecution's view of deliberate intent. The trial stretched on, marked by this tension between two fundamentally different interpretations of the same man. Was he someone who had lost control entirely, or someone who had maintained just enough control to carry out a plan? It's a question that proved difficult to answer definitively, even for those closest to the case. In the end, the court reached its conclusion. James Ruppert was found guilty and sentenced to multiple life sentences. The verdict reflected a decision that, whatever his emotional or psychological struggles may have been, he was legally responsible for his actions. It was a judgment not just on what he had done, but on the belief that he understood it, that he knew, in those 5 minutes, exactly what he was doing. But the story did not end there. Over the decades that followed, Ruppert remained in prison, serving his sentence while periodically seeking parole. Each time, the request was reviewed. Each time, it was denied. The opposition was strong and consistent, not just from officials, but from a public that had not forgotten the scale of what had happened. For many, the idea of his release was unthinkable, regardless of age or time served. Years turned into decades. The case, once immediate and raw, became part of a broader conversation about crime, mental health, and justice. And Ruppert, once at the center of national attention, aged behind bars, largely removed from the world he had so violently impacted. He died in prison at the age of 88, after spending 47 years incarcerated. Nearly half a century had passed since that Easter Sunday, yet the questions surrounding it had not fully faded. Even the house where it happened still stands, a physical reminder of the events that took place within its walls. Over the years, there have been stories, reports of strange noises, of unease felt by those who have lived there since. Whether rooted in reality or shaped by the weight of history, those accounts reflect something deeper, the lasting imprint of what occurred. Some places carry memories in ways that are difficult to explain, and this is one of them. And still, the central question remains. Was this the act of a broken man, someone whose life had slowly unraveled to the point of collapse? Or was it the work of a calculated killer, a man who, despite everything, understood his actions and chose to carry them out? It's a question that resists a simple answer. Because the truth may lie somewhere in between, in the uncomfortable space where human vulnerability and human responsibility intersect. A man shaped by years of pain, who may have reached a breaking point, but who also made a series of decisions that led, step by step, to something irreversible. And perhaps that is why the case continues to linger in the minds of those who study it. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about how difficult it can be to truly understand the line between losing control and choosing not to stop.